If you care about the well-being of autistic people, you need to understand autism. If you want to understand autism, you need to understand monotropism. And that's true whether or not you believe, like me, that monotropism is by far the closest thing we have to a comprehensive theory of autism. It's clear that monotropism is an extremely common trait among autistic people. Even if it turns out not to be universal, it will help you to make sense of both the difficulties and the joys of autistic life. In this talk, I want to explain what monotropism is, why understanding it is so important, and how it plays a key role in autistic well-being throughout the lifespan. I'm a teacher, so I'll have a lot to say about the school years, but very little of it will only be relevant to educational contexts. So, what is monotropism? As a trait, monotropism is a tendency to focus on relatively few things, relatively intensely, and to tune out or lose track of things outside of this attention tunnel. You can also think about it in terms of having relatively few interests aroused at any given time, where an interest in something like its everyday sense is anything that tends to pull in our attention. The idea of monotropism was formulated in the 1990s by my mother, Dinah Murray, and Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser, in an attempt to provide a unified explanation for many seemingly disparate aspects of autistic experiences and behaviours. Why would one type of neurodevelopmental difference lead to difficulty with communication and executive functioning and intense interests and a tendency to stim? None of the cognitive theories of autism that were dominant at this time, and which are still often taught in introductory courses about autism, seem to come anywhere close to providing a satisfactory explanation for all of these elements at once. All seem to break down and make incorrect predictions outside of certain circumstances. What's more, they all simply assume that all the difficulties autistic people experience are due to problems, deficits with the autistic person. Monotropism as a theory of autism filled a gap then. It provided a more comprehensive and coherent theory of autism than had previously existed. As a bonus, it also explained and drew attention to many less well-known traits of autism. And it did all this in a way that made clear that all of the well-known autistic traits could be explained without assuming any deficit on the part of the autistic person. Monotropism is just a different strategy for using attention or processing resources, with advantages and disadvantages. There could be good reasons why humankind evolved to feature many people who are quite polytropic, prone to spreading their processing resources widely, better at keeping track of disparate things, while a few people are monotropic, tending to focus intensely and for prolonged periods, at least under the right circumstances. If these ideas are new to you, you might be wondering how tightly focused attention relates to what you've learned about autism. Does a monotropic processing style really explain the supposed deficits in social imagination and communication, and the tendency to engage in restricted and repetitive behaviours and interests? I argue that it does, with the caveat that everything I've just described is based on non-autistic people looking at us, autistic people, from the outside and frequently misunderstanding what they see. So communication is a good place to start with seeing how monotropism can help us to understand autistic differences and difficulties. Most human communication is based on several channels going on simultaneously. People use words, prosody, tone of voice, eye contact, facial expressions, large and small, and body language all at once, and they expect us to do the same, all at the same time. And all while keeping track of what it means that we're interacting with this particular person in this particular capacity, all while resolving ambiguities in each of these channels, often with reference to the others. So if your processing style lends itself to using a small selection of channels at any given time, communication is naturally going to be different. Autistic people tend to miss some of the subtleties, and those of us who use words tend to rely on them much more heavily than many others, saying exactly what we mean, rather than leaving it to our faces and bodies to do most of the talking or assuming subtext. Meanwhile, we tend to make different connections between things from other people, thanks to our different processing style. All of this means that sometimes we miss things that seem totally obvious to our conversational partners, and vice versa. What's obvious to you is not necessarily obvious to me. Notice here how this way of looking at autistic communication suggests quite different strategies from those implied by a supposed general social communication or theory of mind deficit. Understanding things this way, you might start to get some ideas about where certain behaviors or tendencies come from, why they make sense, and what to do about them. Eye contact, for example, is not something we're just randomly bad at. It can capture too much of our attention, using up processing resources we could be using to follow your words or notice your facial expressions. Those of us who have flat affect might find that modulating our voices and arranging our faces would be too much to handle, along with all the other things we're trying to keep track of. If we're literal-minded, it's likely to be thanks to a combination of expecting people to communicate more like us, like saying what we mean and so on, and struggling to find the processing power to resolve ambiguities while simultaneously keeping on top of all the information channels that people expect us to be using. So that brings us on to social imagination. How easy it is for anyone to accurately imagine what's going on for people who are very different from themselves. It's not easy for anyone. In particular, people in more dominant groups rarely have any real insight into what's going on for people in less dominant groups. Men notoriously complain of finding women baffling. White people who aren't from immigrant backgrounds are often disastrously oblivious to the things that make the lives of those in racialized minorities harder. So who thought it was a good idea to declare that autistic people lack social imagination without pausing to question whether they might be just as bad at imagining the inner lives of autistic people? The failure to recognize what Damien Milton calls double empathy problem right from the start of autism research was a shameful scientific mistake, and it goes on harming autistic people to this day. Assuming that autistic people have an inbuilt deficit in social imagination is as absurd as jumping to the same conclusion about the French when they find British customs puzzling. If autistic people are typically far more monotropic than most other people, processing the world and communicating differently from others, it's hardly surprising that failures of social imagination occur in both directions. And wow, they occur a lot in our direction. All it takes is different enough experiences of the world and such failures become inevitable. I do hope that an understanding of monotropism can help bridge that gap, though. But it also suggests a complication in the story with social imagination. Understanding other people requires tuning into them, and sometimes that can be difficult if our attention is deeply absorbed in something else already. Some autistic children may just spend less time focusing on people than most other people do, and focusing intensely on other things. So by the time they're adults, they'll have had less practice tuning in to other people. Of course, they still might have had more practice tuning into other people than most other people will have had tuning into people like them. But still, a lack of focus on people can compound the natural challenges of tuning in to other people when most of those around you have very different experiences of the world. This is a very gendered thing, I should say. Girls are typically expected to pay attention to the feelings of other people like all the time, while boys can sometimes get away without. The difference in socialization likely goes a long way towards explaining the gender discrepancy in autism diagnosis rates, as long as autism is defined mostly in terms of relations to other people. Girls are essentially forced to practice their social imaginations and refine their communication skills at the expense of being able to pursue their own interests. As part of this, they often develop the ability to mask their autism, hiding the things that mark them out as different. As a consequence, they are less likely to be identified as meeting the current diagnostic criteria for autism, but probably more likely to develop mental health problems. One of the most harmful things that autistic people learn to do when they teach themselves to mask is to suppress stims, to prevent themselves from performing the kinds of repetitive movements that are often the most visible marker of our weirdness. The things that people probably have in mind when they tell us we don't look autistic. Behaviorists often go out of their way to train autistic children not to stim, which is one example of why even the most positive behaviorism can be dangerous. Stimming serves a purpose. It can be one way for a person to feel like they have a bit of control over their immediate environment. One thing they can predict and understand when things start to feel overwhelming. When you need to tune out or dampen down sensory experiences that are too much, or anything that's too much, really, there's nothing quite like a stimulus that you are completely in control of. Realizing this, goes a long way towards explaining why these behaviours are seen as repetitive. Perhaps another factor is the way that monotropic intensity shapes the geography of our minds, like it leaves grooves that we keep returning to. The theory of monotropism suggests that pursuing our own interests is vital to autistic well-being. Part of that is because of their intensity. They exert a lasting pull on our attention so that it can be painful not to be able to focus on them, especially when we are being forced to pay attention to something that doesn't align with our interests at all. Another reason our intense interests are so important is that they can provide a feeling of stability and connection in a world that can often feel disorienting and leave us feeling isolated, for reasons which monotropism, again, helps us to make sense of. There's great comfort for me in exploring physics, for example, something that other people might find by losing themselves in various fandoms or by collecting things or learning everything they can about any number of things. And what I want to talk about, Pete Warmby writes entertainingly and with passion about his special interests and how they've shaped his life. For him, that includes Lego, the Marvel Universe, and gaming. As they are for many of us, they have been both refuges and lenses through which to make sense of the rest of the world. Again, it helps to have a bit of insight into why autistic people have such restricted and repetitive interests in the first place, or passions, as they're usually known when neurotypicals have them. Recognizing their effects and their importance means taking them seriously, where people lacking that insight have often treated them as trivial or even pathological. Bizarrely, despite intense interests being there in descriptions of autism right from the beginning, going a century back to Grunia Sukareva, and again in the research of Kanner and Asperger, there's been very little research on them still. That is starting to change, for example, with work by Rebecca Wood and separately Rosanna Tansley on the power of working with special interests in education. But if you search databases for autism and special interests, you'll turn up far more about the special interests of the researchers, who mostly think they're not autistic, than about autistic people. People sometimes misunderstand monotropism as being all about special interests. It can be understood in terms of intense interests, but only if you understand that that doesn't just mean things we're passionate about. According to the theory, autistic people tend to have our attention and other processing resources intensely pulled towards whatever grabs our interest. Because of that, our long-lasting interests are often intense, and we're likely to keep looping back to them to make links between them and whatever else we're thinking about, to want to talk about them and know as much as possible about that. All of that is monotropism, but that's not all of monotropism. It's not just our passions or special interests that pull us in like this. It can equally be worries. We can get stuck in loops of concern, to use my partner Sunny Hallett's phrase. Unresolved questions and anxieties, things we might prefer not to think about. Monotropic people are often given to rumination, especially if the world gives us a lot to be anxious about, which, speaking from experience, it usually does. Many of us are also prone to forgetting about most other things as soon as something new grabs our attention. Interests can be fleeting, even if they're intense in the moment. This is one place the connection between ADHD, monotropism, and autism is most obvious. It can be hard to stay on task when any distraction can occupy your whole attention. It can be hard to rein in impulsivity if you struggle to maintain multiple competing things in your awareness at any given time. You know, something grabs your attention and everything else just kind of drops away. Despite these challenges, hyperfocus is a huge thing for ADHDers, as well as for autistic people. If anything, surprisingly, ADHD is actually associated with even more hyperfocus than autism. Attention deficit obviously doesn't capture it. We probably need a new name. I quite like kinetic cognitive style. It looks like monotropism may allow us to make much more sense of the overlap between autism and ADHD than any other theory ever has, but there is much more research needed on this. There's a pervasive problem with the existing medical paradigm for thinking about neurocognitive difference, which is that categories based on external observations don't always map well onto internal experiences, let alone observable brain differences. So we've got all of these categories which are fundamentally open to question, but they're not always treated that way. So one way that monotropism relates to autistic well-being is that it can help other people to make sense of autistic experience. Being misunderstood can be exhausting, limiting, even humiliating. Dominant narratives of autism have been very little help here. I won't say they've been no help. In a way, it is better to be seen as diagnosably deficient rather than to be seen as lazy, slow, and thoughtless. Oh, they don't mean to be unempathetic. They can't help it. It's the autism, you know. Still, the way that autism is commonly framed remains stigmatizing and, above all, unhelpful. You really need to understand a bit about autistic experiences in order to formulate strategies to improve autistic lives. And neither the diagnostic criteria nor the currently dominant theories of autism yield that kind of insight. In my experience, coming to understand monotropism often provides a useful scaffolding to build helpful ideas about autism around. One reason it's been slow to gain widespread adoption is, I think, that it takes a bit of thought to start to apply it. It doesn't just tell people that autistic people are deficient in this, this, and this, as if that was the end of it. You need to actually think it through. It might be a simple idea in one sense, but people are not simple. Most of the observed externally obvious features of autistic people are second-order effects of monotropism. It might not be obvious how autistic social and sensory differences would arise from a different attentional strategy, for example, until you give it a bit of thought. So a big part of what I want to do today is to give you a framework on which to build your own understanding and strategies about living and working with autistic people, or as autistic people. I've talked about how monotropism can allow us to reframe the supposed deficits that the diagnostic manuals focus on, but now I want to focus on some of the many things about autistic experience that diagnostic manuals miss out entirely, starting with flow. The idea of flow, or being in the zone, is hopefully familiar to most of you. Those times when you get totally absorbed in an activity, usually something that's challenging for you, but not too challenging. You can learn quickly in a flow state, but you're likely to completely tune out everything else except your main focus. Being yanked out of it feels horrible. I think it's significant that academic descriptions of flow states, for example, in the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, overlaps so heavily with descriptions of monotropism. Damien Milton has been drawing on the parallels for many years, and I think that flow states and similar times of total absorption can do a lot to help non-autistic people to make sense of autistic experiences. In the right environment, autistic people might enter this state of intense absorption many times on any given day, but few schools and workplaces are designed to accommodate that. It's also something that many parents and carers fail to understand. So autistic people are often wrenched out of their attention tunnels constantly, an experience that can be intensely unpleasant and disruptive, taking the place of something that could be relaxing and restorative. If you think of a time when you've almost finished a chapter of a riveting book, or a game's nearly over, and suddenly you're pulled away from it and expect to do something entirely different straight away, with no idea if or when you're allowed to go back to what you were lost in. That might give you some insight. Now, imagine that's happening to you several times, almost every day, and everyone around you acts as if this is perfectly normal and no big deal. Nobody seems to understand the time it takes to shift gears, or the feeling of instability that follows from being wrenched out of the track that you're on. Like many of the distressing experiences that autistic people have, this is made far worse by the failure of other people to recognize that it's even happening. Flow states have been touted as a key to well-being for everyone, probably rightly, I think. They come with a sense of purpose and a kind of easy intensity that are both hard to match. Monotropic minds seem to enter flow states far more easily than others, but being dragged out of them really takes a toll after a while. Sunny has speculated that this may be part of the reason why monotropic people end up in ADHD-type patterns of thought and behavior, constantly jumping from one thing to the next. We're effectively traumatized out of trusting flow states. So we learn to keep shifting our attention in order to be safe. I sometimes think of monotropic attention as being like the flow from a hose. It has to go somewhere, and if it can't flow smoothly, it's liable to go everywhere. So inertia is another of these things which autistic people talk about quite a lot, which autism research really has a lot of catching up to do on. Even though they might look like opposite tendencies, I think monotropic people are prone to getting stuck for many of the same reasons that we're prone to entering flow states. A lot of the difficulty autistic people tend to have with task switching and initiation is best understood in terms of inertia, which I see as a natural result of monotropism. Flow or monotropic absorption means giving yourself over to an activity more or less completely, really investing your mental resources in it. Because of that, it takes time to get into gear, and it takes time to get back out of it again. We need to shift a greater load of mental resources because it's so much harder to divide them. Most of the problems autistic people have with executive functioning can be understood through this lens, I think. And I think it does much more to explain them and suggest strategies than the label of executive functioning difficulties, which I've always seen as a useful but woolly concept. I know that a lot of psychologists really like it, so please don't take this personally. I don't believe that this alone provides a full explanation for the task initiation difficulties experienced by autistic people. I think a good part of this has to do with depletion. It's not just that we need to load up more resources than other people to get going with something, it's that our resources are likely to be lower to begin with. Many autistic people report a kind of inertness that's akin to catatonia, an inability to do anything at all, with no way out except through external intervention, as Lene Buckle's paper on autistic inertia puts it. So perhaps you can think of some reasons already why everything I've described so far might lead to autistic people being utterly exhausted. But let's look into it a bit more closely. I've already talked about how discombobulating it can be to be tugged out of an attention tunnel. It can leave us feeling destabilized, needing to stim or tune out for a while to get us back on an even keel. We're quite often prevented from doing that, usually by people who don't understand what's happened at all at these times. That leaves us dysregulated and depleted. It can feel like a small part of us was left behind when we were suddenly forced to change tracks. The same kind of thing can happen whenever we're forced to shift or split our attention in ways that feel unnatural to us. When polytropic people expect us to be able to navigate the world the way they do, they insist on us regularly performing feats of mental agility that seem like nothing to them. And it's exhausting. That includes rapid task switching, dividing our attention between too many things, having to direct our attention away from our interests and towards things that make no sense to us, being expected to process or filter out too many stimuli, suppressing urges to do things people might see as weird, often several of these at the same time. Masking, trying not to stand out to pass as neurotypical or normal, demands that we constantly do these things. And it's clear that this can take a huge toll on our mental health. Tanya Adkin coined the term monotropic split for the kind of mental gymnastics that polytropic people too often expect of us. I think this is a useful way of thinking about what's going on here. There's kind of a dissonance or a feeling of being stretched to breaking point, and it can have disastrous effects, both short and long term. In the short term, this is the kind of thing that often leads to meltdowns, or their internalized mirror image shutdowns. Either one is traumatic, with meltdowns usually harder for other people, while shutdowns potentially take even more of a toll on the autistic people themselves. Both result from intolerable situations, usually made worse by the people around not being able to understand how bad they are. Shutdowns are often the result of someone feeling so frustrated that they could melt down, but knowing that to do so would be even worse, thanks to other people's reactions. But they can avoid dealing with that if they manage to stay in control enough to do nothing but bottle it up. So, rather than losing control in a kind of externalized way, you're just like tamping it all down, which is not an easy thing to control. Whichever way they go, meltdowns and shutdowns take a huge mental and physical toll and require substantial recovery time. Some autistic people report feeling their after effects for days afterwards, and in some cases, losing abilities that they previously had for even longer times. Autistic burnout is something like a long-term counterpart to a shutdown. The cumulative effects of pushing beyond your resources for too long, for just exceeding your mental and physical capacity, usually because you don't feel like you have much of a choice. Society demands that we carry on, however hard it is, often while insisting that it's easy. And we're surely just not really trying. At some point, we just can't anymore. We find ourselves perpetually exhausted, our cognitive abilities chronically impaired, often with heightened sensitivities and a reduced ability to socialize. This is a grossly under-researched phenomenon, considering it's something of grave importance, which autistic people have been talking about for many years. Of course, it's hardly the only thing that fits that description. Still, research on this should be a high priority, and part of that should be understanding the role that a monotropic attentional style plays in both the overwhelm that seems to lead to burnout and the strategies that can be used to avoid and recover from it. Connecting with our passions, our special interests, and reducing our cognitive load are just about the only things that we know really help. Both of those require a degree of self-acceptance and recognition of our needs that can be hard to come by in a society like this. So let me move on to some of the specific ways that society is not set up for monotropic thinkers and what we might be able to do collectively to change that. School is hell for many monotropic kids, even though a lot of us love learning. There are a bunch of interweaved strands which make school an overwhelming and often traumatic experience. If you know anything about neurodivergent experiences of school, these may be quite familiar to you, but let's see what the lens of monotropism in particular can teach us about all of them. So the sensory environment in the average school seems to be set up with the assumption that noise, flashing lights, and visually busy classrooms are no problem, that learners should be able to simply filter out all of these things and ignore them. School architects and designers rarely seem to take into account that these things occupy learners' precious mental resources and can prevent some students from focusing at all. Too often, the spaces set aside for break times are even noisier and more chaotic than the classrooms and corridors themselves. They may not feel like breaks at all for monotropic kids who already feel overwhelmed by the time they leave the class. Some learners badly need a quiet space, perhaps with low lighting, to achieve a sense of stability and calm. I've heard of teachers and librarians making special arrangements for kids who are obviously overwhelmed at break times, like helping out in libraries or sorting out store cupboards, which is great, but meeting these learners' sensory needs shouldn't really need special arrangements at all. Aside from the noise, another reason break times may not feel like much of a break for monotropic learners is other children. Even if someone gets a little bit of space to hyperfocus for a while, observing insects in the playground, maybe lining up rocks, whatever. Other kids often treat them as weird and might pick on them because they don't understand what's going on for them. There might also be pressure to take part in confusing games that nobody ever really explains properly. My few memories of ball games in the school playground mostly revolve around people being angry at me because I didn't understand the rules or what I was supposed to be doing at any given time. Even if I understood the rules in principle, I always found that team sports involved keeping track of far too many things at once for my monotropic brain. Then there are all the social games. In my experience, these are usually explained even more poorly than football, and the consequences of failing to understand them are even worse. If interacting monotropically with one polytropic person is often disorienting, handling group situations can be downright impossible. All of those communication channels to keep track of, and they're coming and going between multiple people at the same time. How are you supposed to find a space to speak without talking over anyone? How do you manage to say things in a way that anticipates whether other people have any interest in them, when they usually fail to understand what's so fascinating about frogs or physics or Carthaginian history. Some will become students of human interaction, puzzling out the rules and mastering the art of communication in a way that doesn't make other people impatient. Others will remain puzzled by people and puzzling to them, preferring to invest their energies into more tractable problems. Again, there's a strong but not universal gender dynamic going on there. It's far harder for girls to get away with never getting the hang of people. Speaking of not getting the hang of people, monotropic children, and perhaps especially teenagers, often have quite strained relationships with teachers and other school staff, and people in authority more broadly. One reason for this is that, along with all the communication channels I've talked about having to juggle, we're also expected to keep in mind the social relations between us and other people and adjust our communication accordingly. This is another of these things which is hardly ever adequately explained, or maybe we missed the explanation because we were focusing on something else. Instead, we just get authority figures regularly being angry at us for interacting with them the same way we interact with everyone else. These difficulties are often compounded by monotropic communication needs. I vividly remember an angry teacher insisting that I looked her in the eyes when she told me off, which meant that I couldn't take in anything she was saying. So then she got angry at me about that as well. We also get in trouble for failing to moderate our voices in the right way, or for body language that's seen as rude or insubordinate. Many of the clashes come about in the first place because teachers fail to account for the students' monotropism. They expect kids to be able to listen even when they're in the middle of something else, to resolve ambiguities in what they say, to focus on things that have nothing to do with their interests. They also expect kids to follow rules without questioning them or asking for clarification, or to accept rules being broken without explanation, both of which conflict deeply with autistic intolerance for wrongness. We're forever struggling to make sense of the world, and when things don't fit with our understanding of how they're supposed to be, it can be impossible to let them go. One of the worst things at school is when teachers assume that all of this is deliberate, which still happens a lot. As Ross Green puts it, kids do well if they can. Far too often, teachers fail to see it that way and put things down to malice or laziness. They think kids are choosing to be difficult when they're just desperately trying to make things make sense. This is one of the reasons why diagnosis can be valuable, despite the dangers of labeling, why it's so crucial that school staff learn about neurodivergence from neurodivergent people. Without that kind of insight, they won't be equipped to deal with the barriers faced by kids who process the world differently. And it's usually the kids who'll get the blame. Bit more. Some of the hardest things about school have to do with interests. In particular, being required to spend lots of time on things that are of little interest and being prevented from digging deeply into the things that interest us the most. Steering monotropic attention is like steering a big shopping trolley on a slope. It takes a great deal of effort to steer it away from what's pulling it in. And even if we manage to build up some momentum in a different direction, it usually takes us a lot longer than it would for most people. Then we have to deal with slowing to a stop before we crash. On the other hand, if we have a chance to pursue the things that grab us, we're likely to learn quickly compared with most people, and in unusual depth, really loading up the trolley with facts, to stretch the metaphor a bit further. And when you dig into anything deeply enough, you often start to see how it connects with all sorts of other things. I think this is why kids who are allowed to direct their own education don't necessarily do any worse in the long run, whether they're unschooled or at schools that are geared towards self-direction. Sooner or later, everything links together. You get to a point with learning communicating about any topic in enough depth, and you eventually find that you need maths, English, science, and history if you want to keep going. Most schools, though, provide limited opportunities for deep self-directed learning, and teachers worry a great deal about skills gaps being filled before students leave school, which is understandable given public demands of schools and the relative inaccessibility of adult education in our society, and also the limited resources available to schools. But neurodivergent kids who have often found mainstream schools hellish, often start thriving once they enter an environment where they have the time and space to pursue their own interests without the overwhelming social and sensory demands of a typical school. For many families, that means home education. There's something heartbreaking about how many children experienced lockdown as a blessed relief from their compulsory schooling. It shouldn't be like that. Of course, many families have discovered home education for different reasons, often because it was painfully clear that school didn't suit their monotropic children. Alternatively, they found child-centered, relatively child-led environments that have made a big difference. Things like forest schools, Montessori schools, schools with a strong focus on self-directed learning. At home, as at school, reducing demands and increasing children's autonomy can reduce anxiety and help them to learn, while also giving them more space to find joy. Planning gentle transitions gives them a chance to climb in and out of attention tunnels rather than risking whiplash. Working with rather than against monotropic processing can make things smoother for everyone. Many of the same problems we face at school turn up in the workplace as well. Office politics can feel way too much like the baffling and sometimes vicious social dynamics of the playground. Authority figures still expect us to somehow modify our social style to show them deference. I never did get the hang of that. We go on being expected to somehow intuit rules and exceptions to rules that are never spelt out. And we go on being expected to be able to turn our attention to things that are difficult and uninteresting, now with even higher stakes than we face at school. Meanwhile, the fragile coping mechanisms that we often develop in our youth tend to prove disastrously maladaptive in adult life, leaving many of us isolated and facing chronic mental health problems. Unfortunately, mental health care is in very short supply and often even less accessible for autistic people than it is for everyone else. Even so, some autistic people thrive, and most of us have things that we take great joy in. In some cases, we're able to turn our special interests into careers, and if that works out, it can be a beautiful thing. It's fairly clear that academia, for example, has often benefited greatly from monotropic thinkers being allowed to pursue their interests in a very focused way. Unfortunately, modern universities tend to demand a very wide range of different skills from their academics and dangerously grueling time commitments, often making it impossible for autistic people to succeed, however good they are at the core aspects of the job. In the past, many monotropic academics might have had wives and servants to take care of their basic needs while they get on with the business of researching and thinking. A problematic arrangement, relying on a huge degree of privilege and inequality. So there's no going back to that. So what might it take for monotropic people to thrive in academia and elsewhere? There are two closely related problems here, I think, which both follow directly from monotropic thinking. One is fluctuating, spiky skills profiles. The other is a strong drive towards focusing on intense interests at the expense of other things. In the context of a political economy like the one we are currently existing, spiky skills profiles are a huge problem. There are limited opportunities to focus exclusively on the things we're good at, and little support available to help with things that we're not. Most workplaces discriminate heavily against people who can't demonstrate a very wide range of different skills, and even more so against people who they don't see as fitting in socially. That, combined with the promise of pursuing passions, makes self-employment an appealing option for many autistic people, but here again, spiky skill sets can be a massive barrier. Self-employed people need to do a lot of paperwork, and that's something I, like many autistic people, seriously struggle with. I joke about it, but it's actually a genuinely massive barrier. I've known autistic people to lose hundreds of pounds because they absolutely could not steer their attention to fill in a boring, scary form. Likely no more than a side of A4. It's even worse if we're expected to make a phone call. And self-employed people usually need to do a lot of marketing and networking, both major challenges for many autistic people, especially those who've been taught to doubt their own value and abilities. and that's probably most of us. There are many things that could help to make life easier for people with spiky skill sets who tend to throw themselves wholeheartedly into their passions. Unfortunately, none of them are easy to achieve in a neoliberal society. Employers could come to understand that neurodivergent people can be extremely good at their actual jobs, and that they're losing out by discriminating against people who don't have a wide range of barely relevant skills or who don't fit with their idea of a team player. I don't know what it would take for this to come about, and I think we're probably moving the opposite direction right now. Governments could provide more support for day-to-day living with less bureaucratic gatekeeping, but again, in this economy, they could also expand existing schemes like access to work and make them more accessible. When I was first drafting this talk, I started going on a rant about my experiences with access to work, which mostly consisted of emailing to say, yes, I really want to communicate by email. No, I really don't do phone calls. Please stop asking. And then they passed me on to an outsourcer who said, oh, we tried to phone you. Please call us back. Sorry, yeah, this stuff gets me up. So I've often wondered if some kind of skill sharing and mutual aid network might help to fill in some of the gaps in people's skill sets by pairing them up with people whose gaps are complementary. But as far as I can tell, nothing of that sort exists yet. And I've been too busy to try and set it up myself. The organisation, Amazed Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh, manages a bit of on an ad hoc basis, but yeah, limited resources on multiple levels. So the idea of monotropism has been around for more than 30 years. And over the last 5 or so, it's become, within the adult autistic community, probably the dominant theoretical approach towards understanding what autism is, as the Canadian autistic psychologist Patrick Dwyer puts it in his piece, Revisiting Monotropism. Countless people over the years have found it a powerful lens through which to understand themselves and the autistic people in their lives. Many talk about light bulb moments as previously puzzling things fall into place. The phenomenal response to the monotropism questionnaire, a first attempt at measuring monotropism, shows that there's a huge appetite for ideas of this sort, but also many questions still to answer. How does monotropism interact with anxiety and trauma? What about age, profession, parenthood? Can this perspective give any insight into OCD, as Helen Edgar of Autistic Realms has recently argued? Might it help us to understand the relationships between autism and addiction or psychosis, as David Gray Hammond has been exploring? It's clear that there are many things about it that remain badly under-researched, as there are with so many topics relating to autistic well-being. I feel lucky to be in Scotland, where several universities are at the forefront of the shift I see in psychology and allied fields towards taking seriously the lived experiences and insights of autistic people about our own lives. As an autistic teacher with many neurodivergent students, I know that I've found these ideas to be invaluable in making sense of both my own experiences and barriers and those of the teenagers that I work with. They've been no less useful in supporting autistic adults. I'd love to be able to talk about all of this with a lot more peer-reviewed empirical research to back me up, though, rather than relying on personal experiences and community discussions. Science is not the only way of learning about the world, particularly when it comes to human experiences. But there are many, many questions about autistic experiences that only scientific inquiry can definitively answer. And autistic people deserve to have them addressed. I like to think we're finally getting there.
That was amazing, Fergus. Thank you so much. I could listen to you all day. If I win the lottery, I could just pay you to talk to me all day. So do we have any questions for Fergus? Any questions online, guys? Oh, yep, Katie. Oh, we'll go.
Tell us a little bit about education question. I'm particularly thinking about secondary, because I think in primary it's easier to think about what a monotropic, friendly, or respectful curriculum might look like. What do you think if it's not a school that's fully set up for self-directed study, if it's a mainstream secondary school, what might a monotropic, friendly curriculum look like?
It's a good question. And the really tricky, sorry, I should repeat the question, shouldn't I? So what would a monotropic friendly secondary curriculum look like? It's easier to imagine monotropic friendly primary schools, and in fact I think that most primary schools are set up in such a way that kids have a lot of freedom and a lot of opportunity to pursue their own interests. That's much harder in secondary school, where the whole thing is sort of oriented around exams. It's sort of interesting in Scotland that the Curriculum for Excellence, which came in sort of 10 years ago, was theoretically supposed to push us well in the direction of self-directed learning, but it just hasn't really worked like at all, I don't think. I started teaching in Scotland 9 years ago, and I remember looking through the initial Curriculum for Excellence materials and being like, wow, yeah, that's great. And then you get to actually teach an exam course, and at the end of it, they need to just pass an exam. Like, in theory, there are often other ways that they could do it, but nobody really knows what they are. And if you're a professional teacher, then you're probably not going to make something up and run it by the SQA later, which seems to be what they imagined would happen. So, yeah, I mean, certainly in the earlier phases of secondary school, where you've got broad general education, there could be a lot more project-based learning built in. There could be a lot more opportunities for kids to explore their own interests. I really think that there could be a lot more of that in exam courses as well. But again, really, when an exam is the end point, you need these particular boxes to be ticked. And that's just very difficult to guarantee in a given space of time. So I don't know, for me, like a genuinely monotropism friendly education system would make much more use of adult education. We wouldn't be expecting every kid to show us what they've got at the age of 16. I know from experience that many of them can't. They just haven't got there yet. And that's not just autistic kids or neurodivergent kids. It's kids who've had all kinds of difficulties at home, or they've moved countries during their education. Yeah, it's one of these massive questions where, like, really the answer is, oh, we just tear down the whole system and build it from scratch. But short of that, there are lots of things that we can do to, make transitions more gentle, to give people a bit more opportunity to pursue things that they're super interested in. And of course, it's not just about the curriculum. So much of the problem is really just the school environment, the noise, the lights. These are, in many cases, problems which could be solved quite simply when a school is about to be built, but they tend to be totally intractable if they're left till later. And I think they're still not being taken into account in a serious way when schools are being built.
Will we take an online one?
Yeah. So we've got a question about what the working environment. So to what extent do you think changes in the built working environment from single-person offices to open plan and hot desking have increased challenges for autistic people and restricted the capacity for flow?
Should I repeat that one?
Do we need to repeat it because it's already?
Is it there?
It's there. It's
okay.
reading out. Yeah.
The academics in here are with bated breath.
Yeah.
Plan
to a great extent, I think changes in the built working environment from single-person offices to open plan and hot desking have made it impossible for people to attain flow. And I think there are multiple dimensions to that. One is that open plan offices are inherently more stressful. Studies have shown that basically everybody is stressed out in an open plan office. People who have the power will invariably get a desk in the corner and then as soon as they can, they'll get a desk in a completely separate office. So I think it's fair to say that open plan offices, just from a sort of basic sensory point of view, have been disastrous for the population at large, but definitely even worse for monotropic workers. And hot desking as well. Like, so we talk about autistic people and routines a lot, right? People have this idea that autistic people need routines and thrive on routines, which is true, but you really need to understand why it's true, which I think is basically having a routine means that there's a bunch of things that we don't have to think about anymore. Which, if we choose a routine for ourselves, often works beautifully. If someone else tries to impose a routine on us, then we're having to think about the routine, and we're not able to do all the things which we would otherwise do to control our environment and make it, you know, more manageable. Hot desking means that your environment is going to be different every time you end up at a different desk, and you have to deal with all of those changes. It's a totally gratuitous loss of routine, essentially, and like end of predictability.
Have time maybe for one more question? There was another one in here. David.
I was wondering, so personally, I try my best to navigate this monotropic attention into my work because that's useful. But I was wondering if you think that is healthy or good, or if I should just go with where the flow wants me to go, or because I'm trying to get work done here, but it's not always what I want to focus on.
Yeah, great question. So David tries to steer his monotropic attention towards his work. Is that healthy? More or less, right? So it's a difficult one. I think when it works, steering your attention towards work is great, and like that allows us to get jobs done, which I've noticed people appreciate. But I think there are a few downsides and dangers there. Yeah, like sometimes you do just need to let your attention take it where it wants to go. One of the things about monotropic minds is that it can be very difficult to redirect our attention, and it can take a lot of energy and a lot of time to try and do so. So I don't know about you, but I find that if I'm really determined to get a given piece of work done, but like I don't really want to, then I will spend a long time actively just avoiding that and not doing anything else. Sometimes if I let my attention go where it wants to, once that's taken care of, I might feel much more ready to go back to the thing that I've been putting off. So yeah, it's a complicated big picture. There's also the question of whether having work be your main monotropic focus is healthy in the long run. I sort of skated over this in the presentation, I think. Like, you know, there's the old saw about get a job doing what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Like, that's not actually how it works, unfortunately. Quite often when people get a job doing things that they really love, they don't really love them anymore a bit later, and they've just completely ruined their special interest forever. So that's a danger to look out for. And there's the whole problem of sort of overcommitting. Like, I think autistic people sometimes throw themselves into projects in a way which will burn them out sooner or later. So no simple answer to that one.
I think that's us. Well, thank you again so much, Fergus, for that. Another round of applause for Fergus, both online and in person. I just want to say thanks again to all the speakers. Our keynote speakers have been amazing. Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. Hopefully we'll see you all again in 2 years at the next SARG event. As you can see, it's a supportive space, it's kind space, and we're all very collegial. And I've seen some lovely networks being created and built on today, which has been fantastic.